I never imagined a short trip could fracture my life so quietly. Looking back, it wasn't a single moment that changed everything, but a slow series of choices I convinced myself didn't matter. At the time, I believed I was in control. I was wrong that my name is Ethan, and before that trip, my life felt steady. I lived with routine and reassurance, anchored by my relationship with Daniel, the man I'd been with for almost 3 years. Daniel was dependable in ways that comforted me: morning messages, shared dinners, plans that stretched confidently into the future. We had disagreements, like any couple, but nothing that threatened the foundation we'd built. Or at least that's what I told myself. That if I'm honest, though, something subtle had shifted. Daniel had been working longer hours, and I had grown accustomed to filling quiet evenings alone. We still laughed, still touched, still said the right things, but there was a thin distance I couldn't name. I didn't feel unloved. I felt unseen. That distinction mattered more than I realized. Lucas, my stepbrother, entered my life years earlier when my mother married his father. We met as adults, already shaped by our own histories, which made our connection feel neutral at first. Polite conversations at family dinners. Occasional shared jokes. Nothing complicated. Lucas was quieter than me, more observant, with a way of listening that made people speak carefully. I noticed that, but I never lingered on it. When Lucas suggested we take a short trip together, it didn't strike me as unusual. The idea was practical: split costs, attend to a family matter, spend a few days away. My mother was relieved someone was going. Daniel encouraged me to take the break, saying I'd been tense lately. His trust made my hesitation feel unnecessary. I told myself the trip would be simple. A change of scenery. Nothing more. The drive was longer than I expected, the road stretching through unfamiliar towns and quiet countryside. At first, Lucas and I spoke about ordinary things: work frustrations, music, memories that didn't require emotional investment. But as the miles passed, silence settled between us, not awkward but attentive. Lucas didn't rush to fill it. He never did. That was the first thing I noticed differently. Daniel hated silence. Lucas seemed to respect it. When we arrived, the place felt detached from my real life, as if the world I'd left behind had been placed on pause. The rooms were modest, the air unfamiliar. We unpacked without speaking much, moving around each other with an ease that surprised me. I told myself it meant nothing. Comfort doesn't always mean connection. That night, we ate at a small restaurant nearby. The lighting was low, the kind that softens edges and blurs certainty. Lucas spoke about his childhood, about how he'd learned to rely on himself early. I found myself listening more closely than I intended. He asked questions, thoughtful ones, about my life, about Daniel. I answered honestly, maybe too honestly, admitting things I usually kept buried. Lucas didn't judge or advise. He simply listened. Later, back at the room, I checked my phone. A message from Daniel waited for me, warm and familiar. I replied quickly, almost urgently, as if to remind myself where I belonged. Lucas pretended not to notice, but I sensed his awareness anyway. He always seemed aware. When the lights were turned off, sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts wandered, replaying fragments of conversation, tones of voice, expressions I couldn't forget. I felt unsettled, though nothing had happened. That unsettled feeling was what scared me most. Before drifting off, I promised myself I would keep boundaries clear. I reminded myself why I loved Daniel, why I trusted the life we'd planned. Still, a quiet thought lingered, unwelcome and persistent, that this trip might reveal parts of me I'd avoided for a long time. I didn't know then how costly that realization would become. Morning arrived gently, as if the world outside was unaware of the tension that had followed me into sleep. Lucas was already awake when I stepped out, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the street below. He greeted me with a quiet nod, no questions, no forced cheerfulness. That restraint felt deliberate, and it unsettled me more than enthusiasm would have. We spent the day moving through the city with no strict plan. We walked long stretches without speaking, then talked intensely for minutes at a time, as if words had been collecting and finally demanded release. Lucas spoke about his fear of becoming invisible in other people's lives, of always being present but rarely essential. I recognized the feeling too easily. When he asked if I was happy, I hesitated before answering. That pause was my first betrayal. Even before I admitted anything out loud. By the afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from Daniel, asking how the trip was going. I replied with safe details: weather, food, timing, leaving out the parts that mattered. The omission felt small, almost responsible, yet it lodged in my chest like something unfinished. Lucas noticed my distraction and gently changed the subject, sparing me from explaining myself. That consideration drew me closer than I wanted to be. Later, we returned to the room earlier than planned. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken awareness. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands together as if organizing his thoughts. He told me he hadn't intended for the trip to feel this intense, that something about being away stripped him of defenses he usually relied on. His honesty disarmed me. I wanted to respond carefully, but caution dissolved under the weight of my own restlessness. That I told him I felt confused. That the life I'd built with Daniel was real and meaningful, yet parts of me felt untouched by it. Saying those words aloud made them feel dangerously legitimate. Lucas listened, eyes steady, not encouraging me but not retreating either. In that moment, the distance between us felt symbolic rather than physical. When Lucas spoke again, his voice was measured. He said he didn't want to cross lines that couldn't be redrawn. The implication lingered between us, sharp and undeniable. I nodded, relieved by his restraint and disappointed by it at the same time. That contradiction revealed more about me than any confession could. The evening passed quietly. We ordered food, ate without appetite, and watched something forgettable on television. Every ordinary action felt charged, layered with meaning neither of us addressed. I checked my phone again, rereading Daniel's earlier messages, trying to anchor myself. Each word felt distant, like a language I'd once spoken fluently but was starting to forget. When night settled, the room grew still. Lucas turned off the lights, and darkness erased the careful expressions we'd maintained all day. In the silence, my thoughts grew louder. I replayed Daniel's smile, his trust, the future we'd discussed. I also replayed Lucas's words, his quiet vulnerability, the way he'd seen parts of me I hadn't meant to reveal. That I don't know who moved first. What I do know is that there was a moment, a breath, a pause, where I could have stepped back. Instead, I stayed where I was. The choice was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried weight. I felt immediately. The room seemed to close in, not with urgency, but with inevitability. Afterward, nothing felt resolved. There was no relief, no clarity. Only a heavy awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Lucas pulled away slightly, as if creating space for reflection, and I was grateful for that small mercy. Neither of us spoke. Words would have cheapened the gravity of what we'd allowed to happen. I lay awake long after Lucas's breathing steadied, staring into the dark. My phone rested beside me, silent now, yet louder than ever in my mind. I understood, with a clarity that bordered on dread, that returning home would not undo this. The trip had given me more than memories, it had given me a truth I wasn't ready to face, and the cost of that truth was waiting for me on the other side of the journey. The return journey felt longer than the drive there, every mile weighted with thoughts I couldn't silence. Lucas kept his attention on the road, hands steady, expression unreadable. We spoke only when necessary, exchanging practical remarks that avoided the truth sitting between us. The quiet was no longer comfortable, it was defensive, a fragile agreement to postpone what neither of us knew how to name. When we arrived home, life resumed its familiar rhythm without acknowledging what had changed. I unpacked, showered, and tried to wash the trip from my skin, but the unease followed me. Daniel greeted me with a smile that faltered when he saw my face. He asked if I was tired. I said yes, grateful for an explanation that required no further detail. His concern felt genuine, and that made my guilt sharper. Over the next few days, I moved through our shared spaces like a guest. Daniel talked about work, about plans we'd made before the trip, about things he wanted us to do together. I responded appropriately, laughed at the right moments, but my presence was thin. I could feel myself withdrawing even as I tried to stay. The distance between us grew not from conflict, but from avoidance, which felt worse. Lucas kept his distance too. Family messages went unanswered longer than usual. When we did exchange brief texts, they were restrained and careful, stripped of anything that might reopen what we'd agreed to leave behind. I told myself this restraint was maturity. In truth, it was fear. Fear of acknowledging that what happened couldn't be neatly contained. Daniel noticed. One evening, he asked me directly if something had changed. The question was gentle, almost apologetic, as if he worried he'd caused my silence. I wanted to reassure him, to protect him from the truth and myself from the consequences. Instead, I hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than any confession that we talked late into the night, circling the subject without touching it. I admitted I felt lost, uncertain about myself in ways I hadn't expected. Daniel listened, his expression open but guarded. He asked if there was someone else. The room seemed to hold its breath. I told him there was no future with anyone else, which was true, but not the whole truth. The omission lingered between us, corrosive and unresolved. After that conversation, our relationship shifted irrevocably. Daniel became quieter, more observant, as if watching for signs I might disappear entirely. I tried harder, planned dates, offered reassurances, but effort couldn't replace honesty. The guilt followed me everywhere, shaping my thoughts, dulling my joy. I understood then that infidelity doesn't end with an act, it continues in the choices made afterward. Eventually, Lucas and I spoke in person. It happened briefly, unexpectedly, in a neutral place where emotions had nowhere to hide. We acknowledged what had occurred without dramatizing it. Lucas said he didn't regret the honesty of that moment, only the damage it caused. I agreed. We promised each other distance, not as punishment, but as necessity. That promise felt like a quiet goodbye. The decision I faced with Daniel arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a realization. I couldn't rebuild trust on partial truths. One evening, after days of rehearsing words I dreaded, I told him I needed time to understand myself before I could be what he deserved. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, as if he'd been preparing for that answer. The calm acceptance hurt more than anger would have done. We didn't end things with hostility. There were tears, apologies, and long silences filled with everything we'd once shared. When Daniel left, the apartment felt hollow, stripped of warmth. I understood then that choices don't always come with immediate clarity. Sometimes they leave you alone with consequences that unfold slowly. Now, when I think back to that trip, I don't frame it as a mistake or a revelation. It was both. It exposed parts of me I'd ignored and forced me to confront the cost of avoidance. I learned that desire without accountability leads only to loss, and that silence can be as damaging as betrayal. The story doesn't end with redemption or certainty. It ends with awareness. I'm still learning how to live with what I uncovered, how to rebuild honesty within myself before offering it to anyone else. Some journeys change your destination. Others change the way you understand the road ahead. Time did not soften the aftermath the way I expected it to. Instead, it clarified things, sharpening memories until they could no longer be reshaped into something harmless. Days turned into weeks, and I learned that distance does not erase responsibility. It only creates space for understanding. If you're willing to sit with it. Living alone forced me into stillness. Without Daniel's presence, the apartment echoed with choices I hadn't fully owned. I replayed our final conversations, the restraint in his voice, the way he had accepted my uncertainty without demanding explanations I wasn't ready to give. His dignity unsettled me more than anger ever could. It reminded me that betrayal isn't defined only by what is done, but by what is withheld. That I avoided family gatherings at first, using work as an excuse. The idea of seeing Lucas filled me with a conflicted mix of guilt and curiosity. When we eventually crossed paths, it was unavoidable and brief. Our exchange was polite, almost formal, as if we were strangers who shared an inconvenient memory. That restraint was intentional. We both understood that revisiting what had happened would not bring clarity, only complication. Still, Lucas lingered in my thoughts. Not as temptation, but as a mirror. What unsettled me most was not the connection we'd shared, but what it revealed about my willingness to escape discomfort instead of addressing it. I realized how easily I'd rationalized silence, convincing myself that avoiding honesty was a form of kindness. It wasn't. It was self-preservation disguised as care. One evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice was calm, steady, but distant. He said he wanted closure, not answers, just acknowledgement. I listened more than I spoke. When I apologized, it wasn't dramatic or desperate. It was measured, sincere, and long overdue. He thanked me, not for the apology itself, but for finally speaking without hesitation. When the call ended, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. That conversation marked a turning point. I stopped framing the trip as an isolated incident and began seeing it as part of a pattern I needed to confront. I had avoided difficult truths for years, choosing comfort over clarity. The trip simply removed the distractions that allowed me to pretend otherwise. That I began rebuilding slowly, not through grand gestures, but through attention. I paid closer notice to my thoughts, questioned my impulses, and resisted the urge to bury discomfort beneath routine. I learned to sit with uncertainty without seeking immediate relief. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Lucas and I eventually spoke again, briefly and honestly. There was no nostalgia, no lingering tension. Just acknowledgement. We agreed that some connections are meant to reveal, not remain. That understanding felt final, in the best sense of the word. As time passed, the intensity of that trip faded, but its lessons did not. I stopped searching for explanations that absolved me and accepted responsibility without self-punishment. Growth, I learned, isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about refusing to repeat them. I don't know what the future holds, and for once, I'm not rushing to define it. What I do know is that I value honesty differently now, not as an abstract virtue, but as a daily practice. I understand the weight of silence and the cost of avoidance. Some stories end with reconciliation or redemption. Mine ends with awareness and an open question. Who do I become now that I know myself more clearly? The answer isn't immediate, but it's unfolding, shaped by choices made with intention rather than fear. The trip may have ended long ago, but its impact continues to guide me, reminding me that the most significant journeys are not measured in miles, but in the truths we're willing to face when we return.